I trusted my daughter. I gave her everything, my house, my business, my future. So when she invited me on a peaceful birthday retreat in the mountains, I thought, maybe she still cared. But that morning, I woke up in a freezing forest, alone. No food, no phone, no map, just the sound of wolves in the distance, and one haunting sentence echoing in my head. She'll be out of our lives by nightfall. They left me there to die. My own daughter, my own blood. But they forgot one thing. I've survived worse. Before you hear how I turned their perfect crime into their biggest mistake, hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments, what would you do if your family betrayed you like this? Now let me take you back to the moment I realized I was never meant to return. Margaret Hughes had always been a quiet kind of strong, the kind you don't notice until everything around you begins to fall apart, and she's the only one still standing. At 68, her spine was straighter than most women half her age. The calluses on her hands, the measured calm in her eyes, the way she folded laundry like it was a battlefield routine. None of it came from chance. Before retirement, Margaret had been a military nurse in the Gulf War. She stitched wounds under fire, held the hands of dying soldiers in desert tents, and learned to stay calm when sirens screamed and everything smelled like blood and smoke. But none of that compared to raising Lena. She'd lost her husband when she was just 45. A heart attack, sudden, cruel, and entirely unearned. One moment, he was asking for more coffee. The next, he was cold on the kitchen floor. After that, it was just Margaret and 12-year-old Lena against the world. Margaret threw herself into 2 jobs, clinic shifts by day, hospice night duty when she could get it. She said no to offers from larger hospitals, even turned down a position as a teaching nurse at a major university. "Lena needs me," she would say with that steady voice, "and I need to be here when she gets home." Every dollar saved went into Lena's future, private schooling, tutoring, college prep. And when Lena got accepted into pharmacy school, Margaret opened a small neighborhood pharmacy using every cent she'd scraped together for 2 decades. It wasn't fancy. The sign out front flickered. The linoleum inside was from the 1980s, but it was theirs. A mother's tribute to a daughter she believed would one day help the world. When Lena met Ethan, a bright-smiled man with soft hands and too much charm, Margaret tried not to judge. She wanted to trust her daughter's choices. People grow. People change. And maybe, Margaret thought, it was finally her turn to step back. So when Lena asked to take over managing the pharmacy temporarily, Margaret agreed. "Just a few months," Lena had said sweetly, "until Ethan and I get on our feet. You deserve a break, Mom." Margaret smiled. She'd never taken a real vacation in her life, but the thought of Lena standing at the counter, greeting customers, writing out prescriptions, that made her heart ache in the best way. She started baking again, gardening. She even joined a reading club, and for a little while, everything seemed okay. Then came the envelope. Margaret wasn't the suspicious type, but she handled mail with the same diligence she'd once used when checking morphine dosages in combat zones. The letter was thin, standard cream-colored legal stock. Inside was a notice. Property ownership transfer confirmation. Her name was no longer on the business title, only Lena's and Ethan's. She reread the letter 3 times, thinking there must have been a mistake. Maybe they'd added Ethan as a precaution, or Lena had misunderstood some legal jargon. Margaret drove to the city records office the next morning, documents in hand. There was no mistake. 6 weeks earlier, Lena had quietly filed paperwork reassigning full ownership of the pharmacy and the attached property to her and her husband. Margaret's name had been removed entirely. The woman at the records desk, kind but overwhelmed, looked at Margaret like she was just another old lady who'd signed something she didn't understand. "Happens more than you'd think," she muttered. But Margaret hadn't signed anything. That's what chilled her. She sat in her car outside the records office for nearly an hour, the letter resting on her lap like it weighed 100 pounds. She didn't cry, She didn't call anyone. She just stared straight ahead, remembering the day she'd bought that building, the way she'd painted the windows herself, the little coffee maker she'd put in the back room so Lena could study late during her college years. All of it. Gone. Signed away behind her back. When she finally confronted Lena that evening, tentatively without accusation, Lena simply shrugged. "Oh, that? It's just legal stuff, Mom. You said I could manage things, remember?" "I said manage, not own," Margaret replied, her voice more tired than angry. "Well," Lena said, her tone turning sharp, "you were always so worried about paperwork and insurance. Ethan fixed it. He said it was smarter this way. Less tax issues. You're not a business person, Mom. Let the adults handle it." Margaret blinked. Something about that word, adults, felt like a punch to the ribs. Margaret didn't sleep that night. Her room felt colder than usual, the silence heavy with the weight of things unsaid. She stared at the ceiling, the walls, the photographs on the dresser, especially the one of Lena at age 5, missing her 2 front teeth and holding up a glitter-covered World's Best Mom KT name's card. That child had once cried when Margaret was late picking her up from school. Now that same child had stolen everything. The next morning, she rummaged through the house documents, not with anger, just with the steady, methodical instinct of someone trained to prepare for worst-case scenarios. What she found broke something in her: the house deed, the pharmacy, the retirement account she'd spent 30 years contributing to. All of it. Not just in Lena's name, but Ethan's. In most of the forms, Ethan was listed first. Margaret sat on the floor with the documents fanned around her like a battlefield map. She hadn't just been edged out, she'd been erased. She needed air. Walking helped. She headed to the library, the one she used to take Lena to on rainy Saturdays. It was quiet, warm, and had computers for public use. There, on a whim that came from a cold place in her gut, she typed Ethan Holloway Legal History into the search bar. The results took less than 30 seconds to shatter any remaining illusions. Ethan had been named in 2 civil suits for fraud, real estate schemes that left elderly homeowners bankrupt. Charges were dropped both times, but the patterns were there. Both involved elderly women. Both had involved manipulating paperwork under the guise of streamlining taxes. Both plaintiffs had since passed away. She printed the court dockets, folded them into her purse, and walked home like a ghost. And then, 2 days later, Lena announced she was pregnant. Margaret blinked. "You're... really?" Lena nodded, eyes wide, the hard edges in her voice softened by something almost childlike. "Yeah, we just found out. And I haven't told Ethan yet. I wanted you to know first." And like that, Margaret's heart cracked open again. The betrayal, the signatures, the documents. They didn't disappear, but they faded into the background. She saw her daughter again, not the stranger with power of attorney papers, but the little girl in her arms, soft and scared and human. "You're going to be a mother," Margaret whispered, her eyes stinging. "That changes everything." She spent that night knitting. Something small, just the beginning of a baby blanket, soft blue and cream, the same pattern she'd used for Lena's when she was born. She imagined cradling a grandchild, a fresh start, a family reborn. Maybe Lena had made terrible choices. Maybe Ethan had manipulated her. But this child, this innocent life, could be a bridge back. 2 weeks passed in this fragile hope. Margaret made soup. She organized baby books. She even stayed out of the pharmacy, giving Lena and Ethan the space they insisted on. She told herself this was healing. Then came the meeting. Ethan knocked on her door one evening, formal, stiff. "We need to talk," he said, not unkindly, but not gently either. Margaret followed him into the living room, where Lena sat on the couch, eyes unreadable. A new armchair had appeared in the corner. Her favorite one, the one she always read in, was missing. Ethan cleared his throat. "We've been talking about space, about what's best for everyone moving forward, especially with the baby coming." Margaret waited. "You've been staying in the master bedroom," Ethan continued. But it's not ideal anymore. The stairs, the layout, it's not really designed for someone your age. We were thinking it'd be safer for you to move into the guest room downstairs." Margaret stared at him, then at Lena. Lena wouldn't meet her eyes. She was picking at a thread on the cushion. "The guest room," Margaret said slowly. "The one without windows?" "It's cozy," Ethan offered. "I get storage," she replied. There was a pause. Lena finally spoke. "It's just temporary, Mom. Until the baby comes, we need the extra space upstairs. And it's better for you. Less risk." Less risk? Less trouble? Less presence? Margaret stood up slowly. Her knees cracked, but she didn't flinch. "I see," she said, though she didn't. Not really. She didn't understand how her own child could sit there and reduce her existence to a problem to be rearranged like furniture. She returned to her room that night, packed only what she needed, and moved her things without a word. In the silence, her heart didn't break. It hardened. That night, she didn't cry. She stared at the baby blanket she'd started, then folded it carefully and placed it in a drawer. Spring came late in the Pacific Northwest that year, and with it, a phone call Margaret didn't expect. "Mom," Lena's voice chirped through the speaker, brighter than it had been in months. "Ethan and I were talking, and we want to do something special for your birthday this year. A little getaway. Just the three of us." Margaret paused, unsure how to process it. It had been weeks since their awkward exchange in the living room. She still hadn't grown comfortable in the tiny guest room that felt more like a storage closet than a place to rest. But here was Lena, warm, inviting, calling her mom again instead of Margaret. Or worse, nothing at all. That's thoughtful," Margaret replied cautiously. "Where?" "Mount Washington," Lena said. "There's this beautiful lodge Ethan found online. It's quiet, surrounded by forest, just a few days to breathe. No stress, no work, just us. Us." The word lodged itself somewhere behind Margaret's ribs. The next few days passed in a strange daze. Margaret packed her old hiking coat, the one she hadn't worn since before retirement, and a thick book she'd been meaning to finish. She baked a small batch of oatmeal cookies, just like she used to for their road trips when Lena was little. She didn't ask many questions, didn't want to break whatever fragile bridge was forming. When Ethan pulled up in the SUV, Margaret noticed how new the tires were. Freshly detailed. Inside, the leather seat still had that manufactured scent. Lena sat in the front, sunglasses perched on her head, smiling. "Happy early birthday, Mom." Margaret smiled back, a little wary, a little hopeful. The drive wound through stretches of towering evergreens and misty hills. Margaret watched the forest rush past her window, flashes of green and gold. They stopped once at a scenic overlook. Ethan pointed out a bald eagle soaring overhead. Lena leaned against a wooden railing, laughing at something Ethan whispered. Margaret took a photo of them, her hand shaking slightly from the cold. She didn't ask for a photo of herself. The lodge was exactly as described, rustic, nestled at the edge of a deep pine forest, with a creek that whispered nearby. The air was sharp and clean. Margaret inhaled deeply, something inside her chest expanding for the first time in weeks. Dinner that night was simple, but warm. Canned soup, grilled sandwiches, and those oatmeal cookies she'd brought. They played a board game Lena found in the cupboard. Margaret even laughed when Ethan lost spectacularly. "This," Margaret whispered to herself as she lay down later in the guest bedroom of the cabin. "This feels like family again." The next morning, Ethan offered to hike down to the parking lot and grab a second bag. "I packed light," he said sheepishly. Didn't realize how cold it would be. Margaret offered to come with, but he waved her off. "Relax. Enjoy the view. I'll be back in an hour." Lena was in the kitchen boiling water for tea. Margaret stepped outside to watch the mist lift from the treetops. Somewhere in the distance, a woodpecker tapped against bark. It was peaceful, pure. Then Margaret remembered something. "Lena," she called gently. "I didn't see my backpack last night, the blue one. I think Ethan might have missed it when we packed." Lena's shoulders tensed slightly before turning. Oh? I'm sure it's in the car. You know Ethan, always rushing. Margaret nodded slowly. It had my medicine in it. And my extra gloves. Oh, well, Lena said quickly, stirring sugar into a mug. We're only here a few days. It'll be fine, right? Margaret hesitated, but didn't press further. Ethan returned an hour later, empty-handed. Didn't see the bag, he said, shrugging. Must have left it at home. Margaret frowned. That's strange. I packed it myself. I remember zipping it shut and placing it by the front door. Probably still there, he said. We'll grab it on the way back. Worst case, we swing by a local shop tomorrow, grab you a spare set of gloves. That night, the fire crackled warmly in the hearth. Margaret tried to tell herself it was just a mistake, just a missed bag. Everyone forgets things, especially Ethan. He was always the scattered type, right? Still, as she lay in bed, her fingers curled under a borrowed blanket, something cold and creeping began to unfurl in her chest. A flicker of unease, like wind sneaking under a locked door. But she told herself she was imagining things. After all, they'd invited her. Didn't that mean something? The following day, the air felt thinner. The sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue, the kind that promised serenity. But Margaret's stomach coiled with something she couldn't name. It wasn't fear, not exactly. Just static in the air, a low hum of wrongness. Ethan suggested a short hike to a nearby ridge. The view's worth the climb, he said, tossing a new compass into his jacket pocket with a practiced flick of the wrist. We'll set up a small day camp, nothing fancy. You'll love it. Margaret nodded, watching Lena zip her windbreaker. Her daughter seemed distant again, distracted. Margaret stepped into the cabin's entry hall and noticed Ethan's laptop open on the dining table. He was in the other room, rustling through gear, and Lena was outside tying her boots. Just a peek, she told herself. The screen displayed an open browser window, email confirmation from a travel site. She leaned in. One-way rental SUV. Check-in at Mountain Lodge. Confirmed. Check-out. Not listed. Return trip. Empty. No return ticket. No hotel reservation for the next town. No date of departure. Margaret's breath hitched. She scrolled further. The reservation was in Ethan's name only. No mention of Lena. No emergency contacts. No travel insurance. She heard Ethan's footsteps returning and stepped away just in time. The trail to the ridge was narrow and winding, bordered by towering pines and slick moss-covered stones. The air smelled of cedar and damp soil. Margaret focused on each step, but her thoughts spiraled. Maybe it was all a misunderstanding. Maybe Ethan just forgot to finalize the return plan. Maybe. When they reached the clearing, Ethan began setting up the small cooking tripod while Lena unpacked snacks. Margaret wandered a bit, staying close, but far enough to breathe. That's when she heard it. Two voices. One was Ethan's. The other belonged to a man she didn't recognize. Raspy, low, tense. Margaret crouched behind a cluster of boulders near the tree line. Her breath caught in her throat. She knows too much, the stranger said. What if she talks? She won't, Ethan replied. She's old, alone, and dependent. After tonight, we're done. No gear, no way back. By the time anyone notices, it'll be too late. A pause. Then the stranger's voice again. And the will? Ethan laughed low and dry. Already signed, she has no clue, everything's ready. We just need to leave her behind. Margaret didn't move, not even when a branch cracked beneath her boot, not even when her knuckles turned white from gripping the rock. Her blood pounded in her ears. The words hung in the air like smoke. After a few minutes, she stood and walked slowly back toward the makeshift camp. Her legs felt like driftwood, her lungs like stone. Lena was spreading a blanket across the grass, her face soft in the afternoon light. There you are, she said. We thought we lost you. I just needed a moment, Margaret replied. She sat on the edge of the blanket, silent, watching the trees sway. When Ethan went to fetch firewood, she turned to Lena. Can we talk? Just the two of us? Lena didn't look up. About what? About what's going on. About us. Lena sighed. Don't start, Mom. I'm not starting anything, Margaret said gently, but I need to understand. You invited me. You said this was about family. Lena turned then, her eyes colder than the wind that cut through the trees. This isn't about you anymore. You're not the center of everything. You were for years, but that time's over. Margaret said nothing. Lena continued, her voice sharp. You always needed control. The house, the pharmacy, my life. You think love means ownership, but we're adults now. We get to decide what's best. Margaret swallowed. And leaving me here. That's what's best? Lena's lips tightened. You'll be fine. That night, they made a fire and roasted marshmallows. Margaret sat quietly, her hands resting in her lap. She watched Lena laugh at one of Ethan's jokes, her head tilted back, completely at ease. Later, in the cabin, Margaret began to change into her nightclothes. Her bag had been brought in earlier, but it was missing something. Her wallet, her phone. She searched the corners of the room, under the blanket, inside her coat. Nothing. She stepped into the hallway. Ethan's door was closed, the light beneath it still on. She didn't knock. She simply stood there for a moment, then turned and returned to her room. She sat on the bed, pulse steady, thoughts sharper than they had been in years. She wasn't just being pushed out, she was being erased. The silence woke her first. Not the kind that comes with early morning peace, but the kind that screams something is missing. Margaret sat up in the narrow cot, her joints stiff from the mountain chill. The cabin walls creaked slightly, but there were no footsteps, no soft clatter of mugs in the kitchen, no laughter or idle conversation. She pulled on her sweater and stepped into the main room. Empty. No Lena, no Ethan. The fire had long since died. The table was bare. The couch where Lena had napped the night before was neatly folded, like no one had ever used it. She opened the door and stepped outside. No car. The SUV was gone. The spot where it had been parked now showed only crushed leaves and a faint track in the dirt, already fading in the damp morning mist. For a long minute, Margaret stood frozen. Then her nurse's mind kicked in, focused, methodical. She turned back into the cabin and opened her pack. Her stomach dropped. Gone, her phone, her wallet. The emergency flashlight, her first aid kit. Even her coat was missing. Only a pair of worn gloves remained, as if someone had intentionally left behind just enough to suggest a mistake. Margaret moved room to room. She opened every drawer, every storage bin, every cabinet. Nothing. Even the kitchen knives were gone. They hadn't just left. They had emptied the place. She checked outside again. No tire marks beyond the ones already fading. No footsteps. No note. Not even a single breadcrumb of explanation. A sudden gust of wind cut through her thin sweater, reminding her how exposed she was. She turned in a slow circle, trying to orient herself. Forest in every direction. Pine trees rising like silent witnesses. The trail they'd used yesterday was gone, absorbed by the woods, wiped away by the wind. Panic flickered, quick and cold, but Margaret forced it down. She'd been trained for worse. Dust storms in the desert, bleeding soldiers screaming in chaos. She could survive this. She had to. She moved quickly, scanning for supplies, anything they might have missed. Near the fire pit, she spotted something, a scorched metal cup, half buried in ash. She dug it out, brushed it off. Not much, but it could boil water if she found a stream. Near the tree line, she found broken branches. Not from a person, from something much heavier. Margaret knelt and pressed her palm to the earth. A large, rounded impression, claw marks at the edges. Bare. Nearby, another set of prints, smaller, more numerous, more chaotic. Wolves. She stood, heart hammering now, eyes scanning the treetops for signs of movement. The hairs on the back of her neck rose. The forest wasn't silent, it was watching, and she was utterly, dangerously alone. She wrapped the gloves tight around her hands and took a long, steadying breath. First things first, assess, adapt, survive. She had no food, no map, no shelter beyond the gutted cabin, but she had knowledge. Years of nursing in unstable zones had taught her more than medicine. She knew how to ration body heat, how to tell north by the sun, how to listen, really listen to the land around her. She returned to the cabin, tore down a curtain, and fashioned it into a makeshift shawl. She took the metal cup, filled it with melted snow from a nearby ledge, and placed it near the hearth. No fire yet, but when she found dry wood, she'd make one. She'd done more with less. She scouted carefully, staying close to the cabin perimeter. After 15 minutes, she found a broken fence line, likely where the original lodge grounds had once extended. Beyond it, a narrow trail dipped into shadow. Margaret hesitated, then marked the tree beside her with a broken twig cross. If she wandered too far, she'd need breadcrumbs to find her way back. The cold gnawed at her bones. Her stomach clenched with emptiness. But the shock had burned away the fear, for now. This wasn't just abandonment. It was an execution attempt. They wanted her to die here. Quietly, naturally. No evidence, no confrontation. And maybe she would, but not today. She turned back toward the cabin, eyes narrowed, fists clenched. Let the forest test her. She wasn't done fighting. Not yet. The cold deepened as the day waned. Margaret wrapped the curtain tighter around her shoulders and stepped carefully along the ridge. Her boots, worn and too thin for the terrain, slipped twice on the loose soil. But she kept going, each footfall deliberate, every breath controlled. There was no room for panic, not now. She didn't know where she was going, only that she couldn't stay. The gutted cabin was a tomb in waiting. Hours passed. Her legs ached. Her throat burned with thirst. The forest whispered all around her. Branches creaked. Birds flitted unseen. The occasional crackle of something heavier moving through the underbrush kept her senses sharp. Then came the voice. Faint, small, not animal. Help! Margaret froze. She turned toward the sound, holding her breath. Is someone there? She called, her voice raw. No response. She took a cautious step forward, then another. The terrain dipped into a rocky ravine choked with brambles. That's when she saw her, a girl, maybe 11 or 12, slumped against a tree. Her leg was twisted at an unnatural angle, her uniform torn. The green kerchief tied loosely around her neck identified her instantly, a Girl Scout. Margaret rushed forward, her nurse's instincts overtaking the fatigue. Hey, sweetheart, I've got you. The girl flinched, startled, but didn't pull away. My leg, she whimpered. It snapped when I fell. My group, they didn't see. I tried to yell, but... You did great, Margaret said softly, already tearing strips from the curtain. I'm Margaret. What's your name? Chloe. Okay, Chloe, we're going to take care of that leg, and then I'll get you out of here. No phone, Chloe muttered, eyes brimming with tears. I dropped it in the river. That's all right. I've got something better. Margaret winked, masking her own rising fear. In truth, she had no way to call for help, but the girl didn't need to know that. She examined the fracture carefully. Mid-shaft. Clean break, judging by the swelling and angle. Painful, but not fatal. She fashioned a makeshift splint using twigs, her scarf, and a few pieces from her bra underwire. It wasn't elegant, but it would hold. Chloe clung to her sleeve. Are you a doctor? Nurse, Margaret said, tying the final knot. A long time ago. But I remember enough. The girl looked at her with wide, grateful eyes. My dad's a forest officer. He says people don't survive out here without skills. You're like a real survivalist. Margaret smiled faintly. Not by choice, kiddo. She helped Chloe lean against a sturdier tree and built a small signal stack from nearby brush. Tall, dry branches arranged in a triangular tower. I'm gonna light this, Margaret explained. If anyone's out there, they'll see the smoke. The girl nodded, shivering. Margaret struck two rocks together. Nothing. Again and again. Sparks. Just not enough. Then she remembered the scorched cup, still still in her bag. She angled it into the sun, focusing the beam on a dry scrap of bark from her pocket. Smoke, then flame. The tower caught slowly, then roared upward. Dark smoke spiraled above the trees like a beacon. Margaret sat beside Chloe, wrapping them both in the curtain, her arm around the girl's shoulders. She whispered stories about Lena as a child, about tending wounded soldiers, about stubborn hope in hopeless places. Chloe drifted into a light sleep. An hour passed, then 2. Margaret's limbs were numb, her mouth cracked with thirst, but she kept her eyes on the sky. And then she heard it, a dull whoop, whoop, whoop cutting through the air, faint at first, then rising in pitch. Helicopter. Chloe stirred. "Do you hear that?" "Yes," Margaret whispered, a sob catching in her throat. "Yes, I do." Minutes later, the chopper emerged through the mist, wind whipping the trees below. A red and white rescue insignia gleamed on its side. 2 rangers rappelled down with practiced speed. One went straight to Chloe, assessing her vitals, asking her name, confirming her identity. The other, broad-shouldered, wearing a vest that read Chief Ranger, approached Margaret. "You must be the one who kept her alive," he said, voice thick with gratitude. "She's my daughter." Margaret's breath caught. "You're Ranger Thompson," he said. "We've had the entire mountain combed since yesterday. That fire signal saved her." "She saved herself," Margaret murmured, her voice barely audible. "No," he said firmly, gripping her hand. "You did." Chloe was lifted onto a stretcher and secured. Margaret was helped into the helicopter next, wrapped in warm blankets. As they lifted off, she looked down one last time at the forest that had nearly swallowed her whole. The wilderness had tried to erase her, but she had walked out of it not just alive, but witnessed. As the chopper carried them toward safety, toward warmth, toward the world that had forgotten her, Margaret felt the first true tears fall. Not of pain or fear, but of something else. Vindication. She had been left for dead. Instead, she had saved a life. And now, the world would know it. Margaret stepped off the plane with a single carry-on bag and a spine made of steel. The air at SeaTac was thick with moisture, but she hardly noticed. Her body still ached from the cold, from the days in the forest, but her mind was sharper than it had been in years. She was back, and she wasn't done. With the help of Ranger Thompson, Chloe's father, Margaret had flown under the radar. No announcements, no press. Thompson had connections in both state rescue operations and law enforcement. And he believed in her. He'd seen firsthand the girl Margaret had saved. The splint, the fire tower, the way the older woman had sat for hours without rest beside a stranger's child. People listened to survivors. But they respected heroes. Her first stop wasn't home. It was her attorney's office. Claire Hendricks had been Margaret's legal counsel for nearly 2 decades, helped her buy the pharmacy, settle her husband's estate, set up Lena's college fund. When Margaret walked through the door, bruised, scraped, and wrapped in Thompson's old ranger jacket, Claire stood up in shock. "Margaret! Good God!" "No time for shock," Margaret said. "I need to file emergency injunctions. Property, business, full estate freeze." Claire nodded slowly. "Talk to me." Margaret laid it all out, every detail, every twist, the falsified signatures, the silent name transfers, the isolated trip that wasn't a celebration but a death sentence. She handed over the printouts from Ethan's email confirmations, then the final weapon, a tiny digital recorder. "It was in my coat pocket the whole time," she explained, "tucked behind the lining. They thought they'd taken everything, but I'd sewn it in back during my nursing years. Habit from the field." Claire hit play. Ethan's voice crackled through the small speaker. "After tonight, we're done. No gear, no way back. By the time anyone notices, it'll be too late. Then, she has no clue. Everything's ready. We just need to leave her behind. And the nail in the coffin. The will? Already signed. She's out." Claire looked up slowly. Margaret, this isn't just abandonment. This is attempted homicide, fraud, conspiracy. Exactly, Margaret said, and I want them to hear it while they still think I'm dead. They filed the injunctions immediately. Within 3 hours, Claire had frozen the pharmacy's accounts, blocked any real estate activity related to the house, and launched an investigation request through the state's legal network. By midnight, all Ethan's assets were flagged for review. Next was the police. Detective Elena Ramirez had worked domestic cases for 20 years, and Margaret could tell within 5 minutes she was the kind who hated injustice, with the kind of quiet fury that got things done. This recording alone gets you a full investigation, Ramirez said. But with the forest ranger's testimony and your condition, we're going beyond that. We'll be waiting when they return. Margaret nodded. I don't want a confrontation. I want the truth documented. I want them to walk into a world they no longer control. Ramirez smiled. We can do that. Margaret's last stop before home was a small guest house, a safe space Thompson had arranged. She showered, rested, ate real food for the first time in days. She looked in the mirror that night. Her face was thinner, bruised, wrinkled more than it had been before, but her eyes were alive, fierce. The next morning, she stood at the window of her old bedroom, the real one, curtains drawn, watching the driveway. Ramirez and 2 plainclothes officers were stationed in a car across the street. Claire was upstairs with printed documents, and Margaret had brewed a pot of Lena's favorite mint tea. At 10:47 a.m., the SUV rolled up the drive. Lena got out first, chatting casually with Ethan, who trailed behind her carrying her bag. Margaret recognized her daughter's walk, her half laugh. It all felt so absurd, like nothing had happened, like they hadn't left her to die. Lena opened the front door and stepped inside. She froze in place. There was her mother, sitting calmly on the living room couch, holding the teacup like she'd never left. Margaret didn't smile. She simply said, "Welcome home." Margaret watched as Ethan and Lena stood frozen in the doorway, their jaws slack, eyes wide. "Mom?" Lena said, barely above a whisper. How? Margaret tilted her head. "You're back. I must have dozed off. Was the trip lovely?" Ethan's eyes narrowed, scanning the room. "How long have you been home?" "Oh, I don't remember," she said, voice airy. "Everything's a bit foggy since the trip. I think I might have gotten lost. Silly me." Lena stepped forward cautiously. "You don't remember anything? From the mountain?" Margaret smiled sweetly. "I remember pine trees and birds and, oh, there was a raccoon, I think, or a bear. Everything's been so fuzzy lately." Ethan glanced at Lena, something like relief washing over his face. "You poor thing," Lena said, moving to sit beside her mother. "We were so worried. You disappeared during the hike. We searched for hours. Ethan even filed a missing persons report." "Oh, how thoughtful," Margaret said, patting Lena's hand with feigned gratitude. "But it's all a blur now. Probably just my age catching up with me." Ethan chuckled nervously. "Well, thank God you're safe." They didn't suspect a thing. Over the next 3 days, Margaret played the part to perfection. She walked slower, asked questions twice, forgot how to operate the microwave. She even left a can of soup on the stove too long and let it boil over. "Silly old woman," she mumbled as Lena cleaned it up. Meanwhile, Ethan and Lena relaxed. Their tone softened. Lena took over managing the pharmacy again, and Ethan began making calls to realtors about strategic partnerships. Margaret overheard bits and pieces, code for prepping the business for sale. They thought they'd won. So when Margaret suggested a formal celebration, a legacy transition, she called it, they eagerly agreed. "It would mean so much to me," Margaret said softly one evening, "to have one last party. One final thank you to the two of you. Maybe this weekend?" Lena's eyes sparkled. "Of course, Mom, that sounds wonderful." "I want to give you everything," Margaret continued. "Make it official. Hand over all the keys, titles, and documents in front of everyone." Ethan's grin nearly split his face. You mean, like a public handover? Margaret nodded. You deserve to be recognized. And so it began. Lena ordered catering from their favorite Italian place. Ethan had flyers printed, celebrating legacy, honoring Margaret Hughes and the next generation. Margaret selected the guest list personally. She invited a dozen longtime pharmacy customers, a few neighbors, 2 old nursing colleagues, and several very specific names. Claire Hendricks, her attorney, Detective Elena Ramirez, Ranger Thompson, and a discreet contact from the local news station. When Saturday arrived, the house buzzed with warmth. String lights hung in the backyard, trays of lasagna and garlic knots filled the buffet table, and cheerful music played from Bluetooth speakers. Guests milled about, glasses of wine in hand, unaware of the stage set beneath their feet. At 6 p.m. sharp, Margaret stood up and tapped her fork against a glass. Everyone, she said, her voice steady and clear, thank you for coming. The backyard quieted. As most of you know, she continued, I've been considering retirement, and these 2 wonderful people, my daughter Lena and her husband Ethan, have graciously agreed to carry on my legacy. There were polite claps, a few murmurs of admiration. Margaret raised her hand. But before I pass the torch, I thought I'd share a little story about a recent trip we took. Ethan shifted uneasily. Lena gave a tight smile. Margaret reached into her jacket and pulled out a small digital recorder. Let me play you a piece of it. She hit the button. After tonight, we're done. No gear, no way back. By the time anyone notices, it'll be too late. Gasps rippled through the crowd. She has no clue. Everything's ready. We just need to leave her behind. Lena paled. Ethan stumbled backward. Margaret turned to the crowd, voice now firm. This recording was captured 3 days before I was found in the Cascade Wilderness, abandoned without food, water, or shelter. She gestured to the side gate. Detective Ramirez stepped forward, flanked by 2 uniformed officers. You're both under arrest, Ramirez said, producing a warrant, for attempted murder, fraud, and conspiracy. Chaos broke out. Guests murmuring, phones snapping photos, a reporter adjusting his mic. Ethan tried to run. He didn't make it past the hedges. As he was cuffed, Lena sank onto the patio steps, shaking her head, muttering, "This wasn't supposed to happen." Margaret stood still as stone, watching them both being escorted out. Someone from the crowd asked, "Why didn't you press charges sooner?" She turned, smile faint but unmistakable. "Because sometimes," she said, "you need people to reveal their true selves. All it takes is time and a little bait." The police cruiser's lights still flashed in the driveway when the last guest left. Ethan had been the first to go, shoved into the back of a patrol car, wrists cuffed, face pale and slack. The click of the door locking behind him was met with the hush of a stunned crowd. Inside the house, silence reigned. Lena sat alone on the bottom stair, her makeup streaked with tears, her hands clenched into trembling fists. She stared at the floor as if she might fall through it. The music had stopped. The candles had burned out. The celebration banner sagged, half torn. Margaret stood by the window, watching the cruiser pull away. Her arms were folded across her chest, and though her body was still recovering, her stance had never been stronger. Lena's voice broke the silence. "I didn't know, Mom. I swear, I didn't know he planned to do that." Margaret said nothing. "I thought it was just about the business," Lena continued, choking on her words. "The documents, the taxes. Ethan told me it would make things easier. He said you wanted it that way, that you were tired." Still, Margaret didn't move. Lena looked up, her eyes red, desperate. "You have to believe me. Please, Mom. I never wanted you hurt. I thought we were just taking over. You built everything and we were just continuing your work. He made it sound so logical." "You signed the transfer forms?" Margaret said at last, voice cold and precise. "You filed them together." "I didn't read them," Lena burst out. "I trusted him. God, I was stupid. I just wanted to build something. I thought he loved me. I thought he respected you." Margaret turned. "You thought he respected me?" she repeated softly. "Then why didn't you?" Lena flinched. Her face crumpled. "Because I was tired of being second. I know you gave everything. I know how much you sacrificed, but growing up it always felt like I was living inside your shadow. The perfect nurse, the perfect mother, the survivor, the saint." Margaret blinked slowly. "I never wanted you to be me," she said. "I wanted you to be better." Lena buried her face in her hands. Her sobs echoed through the empty room, unfiltered now, ugly and raw. "I ruined everything," she whispered. "I lost you. I lost my husband, my baby." She clutched her stomach instinctively. "He's gone too. The doctor said the stress caused complications. He's gone." A sharp ache pierced Margaret's chest. Not anger, not grief. Something heavier, like the silence between a gunshot and the moment it hits. "I'm sorry," Lena said, looking up. "I know it's too late, but I'm so sorry." Margaret turned away again, her voice barely audible. "Do you know the worst part?" she said. "I believed you. Every time. I believed the lies because I wanted to. Because I was your mother." She walked to the table and picked up a manila folder. She handed it to Lena. Inside was a legal document, signed, notarized, and time-stamped. "What is this?" Lena asked, her voice shaking. "A declaration," Margaret replied. "I've chosen not to pursue criminal charges against you. The DA agreed based on the evidence and my statement. You will not be prosecuted." Lena stared at her. "You're letting me go?" "No," Margaret said. "I'm letting myself go. From you." The words landed like a final blow. "You'll receive no inheritance," Margaret continued. "No stake in the pharmacy. No access to my accounts. As of this moment, I've filed documents severing all financial and legal ties." Lena shook her head violently. "But you're still my mother." Margaret looked at her, eyes clear and unreadable. "No," she said. "I was your mother. I gave you everything I had. Time, love, legacy, and when you had the chance to protect that, you stayed quiet. You watched me fade, and then you helped him take the rest." Lena reached out, but Margaret stepped back. "Please," Lena whispered. But Margaret turned and climbed the stairs, one slow step at a time. She paused only once at the landing, looking down at the woman who had once been her daughter. "This is my verdict," she said, her voice steady. "Not in court, not with prison, but in my heart." She disappeared into the hallway. Downstairs, Lena curled into herself and wept, but no one came to comfort her, not this time. The sun rose quietly over the neighborhood, its golden light creeping across Margaret's front porch, as if unsure whether it still belonged to her. Inside, the house was immaculate. Every picture frame straightened, every curtain drawn halfway to let in just the right amount of light. It felt less like a home now and more like a memory being preserved, gently folded, ready to be placed in a box and tucked away. Margaret stood at the kitchen counter sipping the last cup of coffee she would ever brew here. Her suitcase rested by the door, modest, weathered, and ready. But before leaving, she had one final piece of business. Claire arrived promptly at 9 a.m., a slim folder under her arm and a softness in her eyes. She knew what this day meant. "Everything's ready?" Margaret asked. Claire nodded. "All of it. The property titles, bank transfers, final statements, and public filings. It's officially done." Margaret took the folder and reviewed the contents, though she'd already read them a dozen times. The deed to the house now bore the name of the Cascade Community Medical Outreach Center, a nonprofit that provided care to underinsured patients across Washington. The pharmacy had been transferred into a charitable trust, profits redirected into free medical supplies and weekend clinics. Her retirement fund, once meant for Lena and the baby, was now the seed capital for a scholarship program, the Sarah Hughes Memorial Fund, named after Margaret's late mother, offering full tuition for orphans pursuing nursing careers. Everything had purpose now, purpose that couldn't be manipulated, signed away, or sold. Claire hesitated before speaking. "You sure about all of it?" Margaret's gaze remained steady. "I'm sure. This way, something good survives me, even if my family doesn't." They signed the last page together. The pen felt heavy, but the moment felt light. Not release, not triumph, just clarity. After Claire left, Margaret wandered through the house one final time. She stopped by the dining room where birthdays had been celebrated, the living room where Lena had taken her first steps, the closet where she once hid Christmas presents, labeled with tiny notes in shaky cursive, "For my girl." By noon, the movers arrived. Not for her things, just a few remaining boxes of donations destined for the clinic. She handed them over, nodded politely, and stepped into her rideshare car with a single bag. The car pulled away without fanfare. No one waved goodbye, no one watched from the windows, but across town, someone was watching something else entirely. Detective Ramirez stared at her computer screen, the evidence folder thick in front of her. A new report had arrived from the State Financial Crimes Division, flagging a chain of questionable transfers linked to Lena Hughes, forgery, wire fraud, property misrepresentation. Not just signatures, but falsified documents submitted under the name of a shell company Ethan had created months before they invited Margaret on that fateful trip. Only this time, Lena's name appeared before Ethan's on several filings. Ramirez exhaled slowly. The evidence painted a murkier picture than anyone had expected. Maybe Lena hadn't just been the manipulated party. Maybe she'd been involved from the start. Within hours, Ramirez opened a separate case file, independent of Margaret's. Lena would soon receive a subpoena for financial misconduct, one that carried its own consequences, separate from her husband's arrest. This time, there'd be no mother to stand between her and justice. Back in the quiet edges of the city, Margaret's rideshare stopped in front of a small inn. Nothing fancy, just clean sheets and a view of the Sound. She checked in under her maiden name, Margaret Caldwell. The receptionist handed her the key with a smile. "Staying long?" Margaret considered the question. "Just long enough," she said. In her room, she unpacked only the essentials, a change of clothes, her travel journal, and a copy of her nursing license from decades ago. Not for work, but to remind herself of where she began. She opened the window. The salty breeze rolled in. No noise, no headlines, no family drama, just the sound of the waves. There was no anger in her eyes now, no rage, no fire, only the quiet resolve of a woman who had chosen truth over comfort, legacy over loyalty, and impact over inheritance. She didn't forgive Lena, but she didn't hate her either. Some betrayals didn't need punishment. They punished themselves. Margaret sat by the window with her journal in her lap. She picked up her pen and wrote a single line. Not all stories end in forgiveness. Some end in freedom. She smiled, soft, tired, content, and turned the page. The mountains didn't ask questions. They didn't care where you came from, who you loved, or what you'd lost. They just stood there, eternal, snow-capped, breathing through pine and stone, offering their silence as a kind of answer. And Margaret Hughes, once a mother, once a wife, once a victim, now simply lived among them. The clinic at Pine Hollow Ridge was small, 4 rooms, a trailer-sized supply closet, 1 emergency bed, a pot of overbrewed coffee always sitting on the warmer, just a little bitter, just the way the paramedics liked it. Margaret's corner was by the window where she kept a stack of notepads, a bag of donated crayons for visiting children, and a plant that refused to die, even in the frost. She was the unofficial chief nurse. Though there were no titles here, everyone just called her Miss M. She spent her mornings tending to sprained ankles, patching up mountain bikers who overestimated their balance, and checking vitals for the elderly folks too proud to drive into the city. But the afternoons, those belonged to the children. Every Tuesday and Thursday, she held what the kids jokingly called Bear Bite Club. It was a simple first aid class, gauze wrapping, CPR basics, how to splint a broken wrist using sticks and bandanas. But Margaret had a way of making it more than that. She taught them like she'd taught soldiers once, with steady hands, sharp eyes, and stories that didn't feel like lectures. She never used names, never said my daughter or my son-in-law. Instead, she talked in symbols. There was once a woman, she told the group of 12-year-olds one afternoon as they practiced tourniquets on pool noodles, who trusted the wrong people. Not because she was weak, but because she loved too deeply, and because she believed love meant safety. The kids listened in a way they never did at school. She got lost, Margaret continued, wrapping a noodle tightly with a strip of cotton. But she remembered who she was, even when no one else did. And sometimes that's all it takes to survive. Just one person remembering. They didn't ask questions, not really, but they remembered. She could see it in their eyes. One boy came in weeks later, dragging his younger sister behind him with a belt looped around her arm. She fell off the swing, he said, breathless, but I kept her arm straight. Just like you said, I think it's broken. It was, but it was also properly supported. Margaret praised him gently, her hands moving automatically as she helped secure the splint. You did good, she said. You helped her before I could. That night, she walked home beneath a sky littered with stars so clear they looked close enough to touch. She lived in a small cabin behind the clinic, technically a ranger's post from decades past, long abandoned and restored with love. The wood stove crackled in the corner, a blanket draped across her reading chair. On the windowsill, letters from scholarship students arrived monthly, handwritten, full of gratitude. Dear Miss Hughes, I just finished my first rotation in pediatrics. I thought of you the whole time I wrapped that first tiny arm. You saved more than my tuition. You saved my future. She never replied with long letters, just 3 words, always the same. Keep going, sweetheart. Once Thompson visited. He brought coffee and bad jokes and helped patch a leak in the cabin roof. They didn't talk about the past. They just sat on the porch and watched the clouds. You ever think about going back? He asked gently. Margaret shook her head. I already did, and I chose not to stay. He nodded. No follow-up, just understanding, and that was enough. The local paper came once, did a piece on the mystery nurse in the hills. They wanted quotes, drama, details. Margaret declined. She didn't need headlines. She already had a legacy. It wasn't the pharmacy, or the house, or even the inheritance. It was in every bandaged knee, every child who no longer feared blood, every young adult learning to lead with kindness instead of conquest. One day, she found a painted rock on her doorstep. A child's handwriting scrawled on the bottom, "You're the light up here." Margaret turned it over in her hand. The top was painted with a small mountain and a glowing campfire. She smiled. No tears, no trembling, just peace. She placed the rock on her windowsill, right next to the plant that still hadn't died. That night, she made tea, wrote a few more letters, then sat outside as the last orange ribbon of sunlight dipped behind the ridge. Margaret didn't know what came next. She only knew she was ready. And for the first time in a long time, that was enough. The classroom was unusually quiet that afternoon. The usual giggles and excited whispers of bandage wrapping and CPR chest pumps were gone, replaced by something quieter, more tender. Margaret had just finished explaining how to use a space blanket when a boy in the back raised his hand. His name was Elias, 11 years old. Soft curls, curious eyes, and a thoughtful frown that made him look older than he should have. Yes, Elias, Margaret asked, gently closing the first aid kit. He shifted on the bench, then asked in a voice barely louder than a breath, Miss M, what do you do if the people who leave you behind are your own family." The room stilled. Even the youngest kids turned to him. Margaret didn't speak right away. Her breath caught for a moment, not from shock, but from recognition. She walked toward him, kneeling beside his bench. "What happened?" she asked softly. He hesitated. Then, "My dad left when I was 5. My mom says he still loves me, but just can't live with us. And now she's always working, and my grandma doesn't talk to us anymore. Sometimes I feel like I'm the thing they left." A silence fell that was heavy, sacred. Margaret placed a hand over his. "Sweetheart," she said slowly, "there are 2 kinds of people in this world. Those who leave and those who stay, but none of them define who you are." He stared at her, unsure. She continued, "Sometimes, the ones who should love us most are the ones who hurt us the deepest, and it's okay to miss them. It's even okay to still love them." He blinked hard. "But listen to me carefully," she said, voice steady, full of warmth. "You can forgive someone in your heart and still walk away, still not go back. Isn't that mean?" "No," she said, "and it's survival. It's love, but this time, for yourself." A moment passed. Then Elias nodded. She tousled his hair gently. "You're not what they left, Elias. You're what keeps going." And just like that, the moment passed. The kids resumed their chattering, packing up bandages, stuffing toy bears into backpacks. But Margaret remained kneeling a few seconds longer, staring at her own words as if they'd come from someone else. That night, after the last child left and the clinic lights dimmed, Margaret returned to her cabin. The dusk came early in the mountains. A thin violet mist lingered outside her window as she set the kettle to boil. She opened the mailbox on her porch and found a single envelope, no return address. But the handwriting was instantly familiar, angled, hurried, slightly left slanted. Lena. Margaret stared at the envelope for a long time. She didn't open it right away. Instead, she made her tea, cleaned her small sink, fed the dog belonging to the clinic's handyman, put away the extra sweaters stacked near the heater, and only then, when everything else was done, did she sit down in her reading chair and open the letter. "Mom, I don't know if this will ever reach you. I don't even know where you are, but I think about you every day. I'm not writing to beg for money or forgiveness or anything you might think I want. I'm writing because I finally understand what I did to you. For a long time, I blamed Ethan for twisting things, for pushing me. But he couldn't have done any of it if I hadn't let him, if I hadn't been so bitter, so jealous of everything you built without ever asking for help. The investigation's still ongoing. They're going to find out what I did. I'm not running from it. But before everything changes, I want you to know, whatever happens, I hope you're okay. I hope you're surrounded by people who see you, who value you, who know what I never understood until too late. If you ever want to see me again, I'll be waiting. If not, I'll understand. Love always, Lena." Margaret stared at the page. She didn't cry. She didn't smile. She simply folded the letter once, neatly with military precision. Then she stood, walked to the fireplace, and lit a match. The flames curled at the edges first, licking the corner with orange hunger. Then they consumed the name, the apologies, the regrets. Line by line, the words dissolved into smoke and ash. Margaret watched the paper turn black, then vanish. Not with vengeance, not with hatred, just silence. She walked to the door and opened it. The evening air brushed her cheeks like a soft hand. She stepped onto the porch, where the last sliver of sun clung to the mountains like a promise. She didn't look back at the fireplace. She didn't need to. Behind her, the smoke curled upward, taking every unsaid thing with it. In front of her, the trees rustled softly. Somewhere down the slope, a coyote called into the dusk. A pair of children's laughter echoed faintly near the clinic, and in the last golden light streaming through the cabin window, Margaret smiled. Not the smile of someone who won, but of someone who survived and chose peace anyway. She pulled her shawl tighter, took one step forward, then another. Not back, not down, but through. And the light followed her.